In 1943, the United States Army put anti-aircraft guns in the hills above a Massachusetts town of 15,000 people. Greenfield had no shipyard, no airfield, no arsenal. What sat under those guns was a complex of brick mills on the Green River that made small pieces of hardened steel most people outside the trade could not name. The Germans had bombed Sheffield and Coventry for the same reason. Whoever controlled the threads controlled the war. That was 1943. In August of 2025, an auctioneer stood in that same plant and sold the last machines to whoever bid highest. You are watching Trade Archive. Greenfield, Massachusetts, 1870. The town sits where the Green River meets the Deerfield, north of Springfield, with water power, a rail line, and a reputation for steel. That reputation belonged to one family. In 1833, John Russell built a cutlery works on the Green River and began turning out knives by machine at a time when nearly every other American knife was forged one at a time by hand. Russell blades went west with the fur trade and the hide hunters, and the phrase "up to Green River" entered American slang as a way of saying all the way to the hilt. By 1870, the cutlery had moved upriver to Turner's Falls, chasing bigger water. It left behind an empty brick mill on the riverbank and a town full of men who knew how to cut metal. Into that town walked a machinist named John J. Grant, born in Leicester, England, working out of Northampton, and carrying an idea about screw threads. In 1870, a screw thread in most American shops was not cut. It was crushed. A machinist forced an iron rod through a hardened plate, and the plate displaced the metal into something roughly helical. What came out the other side was bruised, work-hardened, and full of microscopic tears. Those threads stripped. They seized. They fit one nut and no other. Every bolt was effectively a custom part married to a single hole. That was a serious problem, because the entire promise of American manufacturing rested on the opposite idea. Downriver at the Springfield Armory, the government had spent decades proving that a musket could be assembled from parts made by different men in different buildings, and that a broken lock could be replaced out of a bin instead of a forge. Interchangeability was the whole bet, but interchangeable parts have to be held together, and in 1870, the fasteners holding them together were the least interchangeable things in the machine. Grant's idea was to stop crushing and start cutting. On October 24, 1871, the Patent Office granted him number 120,266 for an improvement in die ease for cutting screw threads. The device was two threaded pieces of hardened steel seated in a collet, and because they were adjustable, a machinist could take a light pass, then a heavier one, then dial the die in a few thousandths to compensate for wear. It sliced the helix instead of bullying metal into the shape of one. The threads came off clean, sharp, and repeatable. Grant set up first in Luther Pratt's shop in the Hope Street steam mill, briefly as Pratt and Grant, then reorganized with about a dozen partners as the Cooperative Machine Company. What he did not have was capital. A precision tool business needs steel inventory, buildings, and men, and Grant had a patent and a bench. So he sold the patent. Two men bought it, Solon L. Wiley and Charles P. Russell, and Russell's surname was not a coincidence. He was John Russell's nephew. In 1872, the pair founded the Wiley and Russell Manufacturing Company, took over the empty cutlery building on the Green River, and stamped their thread-cutting tools with two trademarks. One was Lightning. The other was Green River, which in the American West still meant all the way. Grant left in 1873. He went to Hartford and organized the tap and die branch of Pratt Whitney. The man who solved the thread problem sold it, left town, and built the same business for a competitor 100 miles south. His name is on the patent. It was never on the building. Wiley and Russell had a good product and an immediate problem. Grant's die cost roughly 16 times what the old crushing plate cost, and selling a shop owner a tool at 16 times the price of the one already bolted to his bench is a hard afternoon. The pitch was simple enough. A lightning screw plate pays for itself in threads that do not strip. It worked. Within a few years, the company had expanded into farrier tools, blacksmith equipment, wheelwright machinery, and hand drilling machines. And it was doing something it had not planned on. It was training its own competition. Two of the men on its floor were brothers, Frederick E. Wells and Frank O. Wells, sons of a Franklin County family that had been in the Western Hills for 2 generations. Around 1874, they walked out and set up their own shop on the north bank of the Green River, a short distance upstream from the men who taught them. And then, the building burned. The fire came around 1876, early enough that the brothers had almost nothing behind them and nothing in reserve. They lost the shop. What they did next is the reason this story exists at all. They did not fold, and they did not go back. They carted the salvage down to the B.B. Noyes foundry on Hope Street, set up in borrowed space, and kept cutting threads while they rebuilt. And it was in that borrowed foundry, working out of somebody else's building after losing their own, that the Wells brothers developed their version of the adjustable die. They came back to the river in 1878 with a better tool than the one they had left with. In 1879, a man named Franklin E. Snow joined them, and the firm became Wells Brothers and Company. Snow brought money and business discipline, and what the Wells brothers brought was a brand. Wiley and Russell had lightning. The Wells brothers went the other direction and called theirs Little Giant, which is the kind of name a small shop picks when it intends to be a problem for a large one. On February 3, 1885, they patented their adjustable die design. By 1888, the company had incorporated and moved into a factory complex that dwarfed the shed they started in. Greenfield now had 2 thread empires facing each other across the same water, and a dozen smaller shops filling in around them. The town had a nickname coming. The rivalry did not stay outside the family. In 1900, Frederick E. Wells left the company he had built with his brother, partnered with his own son, and formed F. E. Wells & Son to make pipe threading tools and lathes under the economy name. Frank O. Wells stayed and ran Wells Brothers into the new century, into the age of the automobile, when every engine block and axle and steering column in America suddenly needed threads by the million. He had no idea that a banker in Boston was already buying up his rival. By 1910, the tap and die business in Greenfield was overheating. More than a dozen independent shops in one small town, all making variations of the same tools, all cutting each other's prices to hold contracts. This was the age of the American trust, when the fashionable solution to competition was to buy it. Enter Frederick H. Payne. Greenfield-born, Boston-based, a financier with connections that ran into Washington, and a man who would later serve as Assistant Secretary of War under Herbert Hoover. Payne had quietly accumulated a controlling position in Wiley and Russell stock. Then he went to Frank O. Wells with a proposal that was less an offer than an arithmetic problem. Merge, or keep bleeding. On April 2, 1912, the two rivals became one company, the Greenfield Tap Die Corporation. Frank O. Wells was named president. Payne took the vice presidency. And something happened in that transaction that had never happened in Franklin County before. GTD became the first publicly traded business in the county's history, which meant that for the first time, the men who owned the mills on the Green River did not live anywhere near the Green River. The acquisitions started immediately. A J. Smart Manufacturing in October of 1912. In 1917, the company brought Frederick Wells back into the fold by buying F. E. Wells & Son and picked up Nutter and Barnes for cutting off machines, and the Bickford Works for lathes and screw machines in the same stretch. Lincoln Twist Drill followed in 1920. The Greenfield Machine Company and its internal grinders came in 1921. By then, GTD was exporting more than a third of everything it made. It published a 408-page catalog. It registered the three letters, GTD, as a trademark on October 11, 1921, and those three letters became, for the better part of a century, the mark a machinist looked for before he trusted a tap in an expensive casting. Franco Wells, the machinist who reportedly started his workdays out on the floor checking measurements, resigned the presidency in 1919. Payne took over. In time, the top job went to a man who commuted to Manhattan. Which brings us to the part of this story that almost never gets told, because it is the part that requires you to understand what these people actually did all day. A tap is a hardened steel rod with cutting teeth on the outside, used to cut threads into a hole. A die cuts threads onto a rod. Both are simple to describe and brutally difficult to make, because the tool has to be harder, more accurate, and more consistent than the part it creates. You cannot cut a precise thread with an imprecise tool. Every error in the tap becomes an error in every hole it ever touches, and then in every bolt that goes into those holes, and then in every machine built from those bolts. So here is what a piece of steel went through inside those buildings. It started in the forge shop, where the hammermen worked hot metal into rough blanks. GTD advertised that it kept $3 million worth of steel on hand at all times, which in that era was less a boast than a strategic reserve. From the forge, the blank went to machining, where the flutes were cut and the body was turned. Then heat treatment, where the steel was hardened, and hardening is the step that separates a tool company from a machine shop. Because a tap that is too hard shatters in the hole, and a tap that is too soft rounds off on the second pass, and the difference between those two failures is a matter of degrees and minutes in a furnace. After hardening came grinding, and grinding is where the money was. The threads, the flutes, the chamfer at the leading edge, all of it ground to shape after the steel was already hard. GTD used a process the trade called machine relieving, which cut away the thread form behind the cutting edge, so the tap did not drag against the walls of its own hole. Less friction, less heat, fewer broken taps buried in expensive parts. Then lapping and polishing, much of it finished by hand. Then the gauge room. That is the part of the operation that ordinary people never picture. In a plant that measured its output in tons, there were men grinding to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. One of them, a toolmaker named Randolph Sull, ground small gauges to 3 10,000ths of an inch all day long. 3 10,000ths. That is a small fraction of the thickness of a human hair, held not once for a demonstration, but repeatedly, on a shift, for a paycheck. The men who did that work were not hired. They were made. GTD ran a formal apprentice school, and the certificate it issued opened doors in machine shops across the country. The rule inside the company was that a foreman had to have served an apprenticeship and worked the floor, which meant the man timing your work had once done your work. Then, that rule changed. The story of what GTD's own machinists were capable of is best told through a man named John Clancy, who left school at 11 years old. Clancy rebuilt a threading machine so that it produced 7 or 8 times the work it had before. Having done that, he went back and redesigned it again and multiplied the output by roughly the same factor a second time. A boy who never finished grade school delivered a productivity gain in a single machine that most modern engineering departments would put in a press release. But GTD was now a public company, and public companies answer to people who have never seen a forge shop. In the early 20th century, outside investors brought scientific management to Greenfield. Time study men in white coats came onto the floor and stood behind machinists with stopwatches, timing every reach, every turn of a handle, every walk to the tool crib. The data was then used to speed the line, eliminate what the men in coats classified as wasted motion, and hold down piece rates. Understand what that meant to the man at the bench. These were craftsmen who had served years of apprenticeship to earn the right to hold 3 10,000ths of an inch, and they were now being measured by a stranger who could not run the machine. The stopwatch did not just cut their pay. It told them what they were worth to the men who owned the stock. That resentment sat on the floor of those buildings for 2 decades before it detonated. While it simmered, the town got rich. GTD built a 5-story cement mill at the Plant 1 site on the Green River in 1921, and around 1930 raised a smokestack of yellow clay tile, 50 feet tall and 12 feet across, that dominated the skyline. The company published a monthly magazine called The Helix, named for the fact that a perfect thread traces a true helix, which tells you exactly how these people thought about themselves. There was a company orchestra, baseball, bowling, and tennis teams, a fish and game club, field days where departments built floats and paraded to the fairgrounds, a benefit association that cost $2 a year and paid $7 a week when you were sick, a housing department, classes for women operators, and English classes for immigrant workers. The company was not just where you worked, it was the architecture of an entire town's social life. Then came the war, and Greenfield stopped being a manufacturing town and became a strategic asset. In 1940, before the United States entered the fighting, the federal government financed a $1 million gauge plant on Sanderson Street. Not a tool plant, a measuring plant. Inside that building, temperature and humidity reportedly never varied by more than 1%, because steel expands when it warms, and a gauge that has grown by a fraction of a thousandth is no longer telling the truth. That building is the reason the anti-aircraft guns went up in the hills. Here is the logic. Modern mechanized war is an assembly problem. A Sherman tank, a B-17, a Browning machine gun. Every one of them is thousands of threaded parts made in hundreds of factories by companies that have never spoken to each other, and all of it has to fit on the first try, in the field, under fire, with a wrench and no machinist. The only thing making that possible is a shared standard of measurement. Somebody has to make the master gauges that every other factory checks its work against. GTD made roughly a third of the world's gauges. Take out Greenfield, and you do not slow one factory. You desynchronize the arsenal. The Luftwaffe had already worked this out and gone after Sheffield and Coventry, the British cutting tool centers, early in the war. So the guns went into the hills above the Green River, and across town, the Threadwell plant on Arch Street had anti-aircraft guns mounted on its roof. Production went to levels that had no precedent. By January of 1943, the payroll had swelled to 3,558 people running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The helix was renamed Leads and Angles. The town picked up the name that stuck to it for the rest of the century. Tap Town. About a third of that workforce was women, brought in as the men shipped out, working the machines and the inspection benches, and paid less than the men whose jobs they were doing. The company handed out seeds and set aside plots for victory gardens so families could feed themselves under rationing. The federal government awarded GTD the Army Navy E for excellence in war production, and the flag went up over the plant. And on those same floors, in those same years, the machinists finally organized. In June of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the workers of Greenfield Tap Die voted by nearly 2-1 to join the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America. They chartered UE Local 274. Wages rose. A shop steward system appeared, which meant that for the first time a foreman's decision could be challenged by somebody standing on the floor with a piece of paper and a contract behind him. The men with the stopwatches had finally met an opponent who kept his own records. By 1949, the ground had shifted under all of it. The country was in the middle of the Red Scare, and the UE was directly in the crosshairs. It had refused to purge members over their politics. It had pushed hard on civil rights and on equal pay for the women in its shops. That made it a target for the federal government, for rival unions, and for every employer who had spent a decade losing arguments to a shop steward. The rival union was the IUE, led by James Carey, and Greenfield became one of the places where that national fight was decided building by building. What happened in this small, conservative, rural county was genuinely strange. Priests picketed, Churches took out full-page newspaper advertisements against the union. The workers were told, from pulpits and front pages, that the men they had elected were a threat to the country. On January 24, 1950, Local 274 voted on whether to keep the UE. The count was 396 to 332. They stayed. When the raid came again, they voted to stay by roughly 3-1. The most quoted line to come out of that fight belongs to a UE organizer named Dave Cohen, remembering how Yankee Republican machinists in Franklin County talked about their radical organizer Hugh Harley. He may have been a communist, they said, but he was theirs. That is the whole story of Greenfield in one sentence. These were not radicals. They were conservative rural New Englanders who had decided, on the evidence in front of them, that the loyalty question was a business tactic wearing a flag. In April of 1952, more than 1,000 GTD workers packed into the Garden Theater in downtown Greenfield to take a strike vote. Above their heads, the marquee was advertising a swashbuckling musketeer picture called At Sword's Point. A photographer caught it, and the image became the single most famous photograph in the town's labor history. And then they voted not to strike. The following year, GTD pushed too far on wages and on health insurance, including coverage for anesthesia, and the answer came back differently. In 1953, for the first time in the company's history, the entire plant walked out. They were out 11 days. They came back with a wage increase and a better health plan. 11 days was all it took, and the reason is arithmetic. In 1953, nobody else could make what they made. Everything after that is the story of that arithmetic changing. The first change was automation. Machines arrived that could do the work of several skilled men, which lowered cost and hollowed out the leverage at the same time. The second change was the corporate structure itself. On February 11, 1958, after 46 years, Greenfield Tap Die lost its independence, merging with United Greenfield Corporation to form the United Greenfield Corporation. A decade later, in 1968, United Greenfield was swallowed whole by TRW, a conglomerate whose interests ran from aerospace to automotive parts to consumer credit reporting. The buildings on the Green River still said Greenfield on the letterhead. But the men deciding their future now had a portfolio, and Greenfield was one line in it. For years afterward, the workers on Sanderson Street made the same complaint, and it was never about wages. It was that nobody was investing. The machines they ran had been bought and paid for decades earlier. The profits went out of Franklin County and did not come back as capital equipment. You can run a plant that way for a long time. You cannot run it forever. In 1986, TRW sold the Greenfield division to the Harbor Group, a private equity firm out of St. Louis, which spent the next decade assembling a cutting tool portfolio around it. Vermont Tap Die in 1991. Cleveland Twist Drill in 1994. In 1993, the whole collection was floated as a public company called Greenfield Industries, and in 1992, Plant 1 was abandoned. 13 buildings, roughly 10 acres. 145,000 square feet of floor space, still fed by a canal and turbine system off the Green River. All of it shut and left standing. What was left behind in the ground is the part of industrial history that does not make it into the company magazine. For a century, cutting and hardening steel meant solvents, quenching oils, and cutting fluids. And in the era before environmental regulation, 3 of the older buildings at Plant 1 had collected their industrial waste in unlined cement pits recessed directly into the factory floor. Over decades, those pits cracked. Underneath the site sat fuel storage in 6 locations, including tanks of 40,000, 15,000, and 10,000 gallons. When the assessments were finally done, the soil came back loaded with petroleum hydrocarbons, degreasing solvents, and cutting oils carrying barium, chromium, and lead. The transformers had left PCBs. The heavy metals in that ground were the direct byproduct of the same metal cutting processes that made the town famous. On December 12, 2001, an agreement among Greenfield Industries, TRW, and the town settled who would clean it up. Demolition started in August of 2002. Preservationists had hoped to save the yellow tile smokestack, the one thing on the skyline that said, "This place made something." It came down with the rest. The site is a senior living community now, the Arbors at Greenfield. There are people living quiet retirements on top of the ground where the world's threads were cut. Meanwhile, the surviving operation kept changing hands. On October 12, 1997, Kennametal of Pittsburgh agreed to acquire Greenfield Industries in a transaction valued at roughly $1 billion, $38 a share in cash against a Friday close of $32 and change, plus about $320 million in assumed debt. The deal closed on November 18th. The GTD name survived as a premium brand inside Kennametal's Whittier Group, which is the industrial equivalent of a taxidermied animal. The mark stayed. The company was gone. Local 274 did not go anywhere. In August of 2019, with the membership down to around 70 people, Kennametal came after the health plan, pushing to replace it with a high deductible plan and reserving the right to change the terms without negotiating. They wanted mandatory overtime. They wanted temporary workers doing bargaining unit jobs. The members struck on August 12th. They were out 3 days. The company came back to the table. 66 years after their grandfathers greased the machines and walked out, a few dozen people in a shrinking plant were still winning arguments with a company 1,000 times their size. It ended on paper, in Pittsburgh. On January 14, 2025, Kennametal told investors it was closing 3 to 5 plants, projecting annualized pre-tax savings of about $15 million against roughly $25 million in charges. Greenfield was on the list, alongside a consolidation of 2 facilities in Barcelona. The state layoff notice filed at the end of January put the number of affected employees at 54. Manufacturing at Greenfield ceased on April 15, 2025. 8 people stayed behind to close the building. Coates, the chief shop steward, had started in 1988 when there were 500 workers in that plant. He finished with about 55. And he pointed out something that went almost entirely unreported. With Greenfield closed, Kennametal no longer has a single unionized facility anywhere in the United States. On August 6, 2025, Kennametal reported its fourth quarter. The savings had come in at about $35 million, well past the $15 million target. The company noted that it had substantially completed the closure of a facility in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and the consolidation in Barcelona. The very next morning, an industrial liquidator ran the auction. The high-performance cutting tool machinery went out the door in lots to the highest bidder. One machinist who walked the floor during the preview noted the date stone still set over a doorway on Sanderson Street. 1902. A few miles from where the auctioneer stood, in an old mill building on the same river, volunteers at the Museum of Our Industrial Heritage keep the other version of this story. Vintage machines that still run, digitized catalogs, copies of the helix, a gauge room laid out the way a gauge room was laid out, retired machinists who will walk you through what a machine-relieved tap is and why it matters, if you ask. So, what was actually lost? Not a brand. The GTD mark still exists on a catalog page. Not the technology either, because the knowledge of how to grind a tap is written down, and taps are still made in other countries, by other companies, for less money. What ended was a specific arrangement between a place and the work it did. In Greenfield, for a century and a half, the person who ground the gauge lived a mile from the furnace that hardened it, drank at the same club, sent his kids to the same school, and served an apprenticeship under a man who had served one himself. The knowledge did not live in a document. It lived in the town. That arrangement made a boy who left school at 11 into an engineer and it made a rural county that voted Republican into a place that would face down a national loyalty campaign rather than let a stranger tell them what their work was worth. You cannot line items on a savings target, which is precisely why it was so easy to close. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like if you haven't already, and subscribe to Trade Archive, and we will see you at the next one.